Hello and welcome to a Cavell podcast. I'm here with 2600 Hertz. It is a lovely March day. The sun is shining and we are still in home offices, but in good spirits. My name is Fimar Goodbegley. I'm one of the analysts at the Cavell Group and excited to be here talking to you all today. I'm here with Patrick from 2600 Hertz. Maybe you want to introduce yourself to our listeners, Patrick.
Finbar, first of all, thank you for having us. My name is Patrick Sullivan. I am the co-founder at 2600 Hertz, and we focus on large-scale UC deployments around the world.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the UC market is one of those that is booming in the current lockdown era, as people still need to talk to each other and are doing so even more remotely than they have ever been doing before. And what are your thoughts on that market? I mean, we're 3 months into 2021. Lockdowns all over the world are still going on. Is it a good time for the UC market?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So from our point of view, when COVID first, really started to not just happen, but, increase in size, and when people started to understand that it wasn't business as usual, our initial worries, like everybody else, was, where's the market going to go? How's it going to affect businesses? How's it going to affect the people? And what we've learned over the year is that, COVID has really, defined the way people work remotely and has kind of made people adjust pretty quickly. And what we've learned, especially in the UC market, is that people have to be able to work anywhere around the world. There's no such thing as a traditional office right now. And a lot of people have to be, in the office or out of the office. But really the key is being able to be connected anywhere they're at. And what we're seeing is that the UC growth has been pretty dramatic in the United States and then extremely dramatic in Europe. And I think a lot of that is around the idea that, people traditionally had more servers in their offices and had to be connected to their office. And now that you're working remotely, you have to have, connectivity just about anywhere you go. And, communications really is the key with a distributed team.
Yeah, and I think that's a very, very good point, is that idea that now it's shifted away from this centralized office-based environment where a lot of communications was face-to-face into this distributed one where we're looking at unified communications and cloud communications as that essential model for even just allowing businesses to function. And I mean, what do you think, looking back at the past year, obviously, you said there was a great shift in companies to adjust, but what do you think the lessons that, you yourself as a company have learned, or maybe lessons that your customers have learned that you think are really important?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our customers are really service providers and resellers, people who like to white label our solution and then go to market. And one of the key differentiations in our service is that everything is an API, and which means that you get the services out of the box, but it also gives you the capabilities to customize it however you're looking for. And I think one of the things that we've been learning is that service providers and resellers now more than ever need to be able to kind of customize their solution for their end users based on what they're looking for. And some examples are, if you're dealing with customers that are in the medical industry, having a more of a video first applications is extremely important. Just because a lot of people are comfortable going to the doctor for non-emergencies, and so video first is a pretty big deal when you're dealing with remote workers who want to see their doctor, but they don't actually want to go in for fear of catching COVID if they just have a sore throat or a runny nose. And that's just one example. There's a ton of other examples that our resellers and service providers have been able to utilize using that kind of customizations, where they can really make sure that the workflow for their end users is more defined around what they need versus traditionally, if you go back 5 years ago, it was just like a one size fits all mentality. And I think that mentality is kind of changing, where people really want to, make it better for their customer by being able to customize, the actual end customer's workflow. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, one of the things that Cavell has seen through its research in this space over the past year is just, people's comments are, if you ask them what are the most important part of the solution, they're talking about, can I manage it easily from a central portal? Are there APIs that tie into my existing systems that let me make it do what I want it to do? People are very much looking for that tool that molds itself to meet their business rather than finding a tool that does a good enough job but doesn't really do what they need it to do. So that interesting take on video for the medical space, I think, is really, really sort of hits that nail on the head. I think that's maybe you agree with this, and that's potentially one of the ways that service providers and people providing UC are going to differentiate themselves in the future, is that vertical focus that lets them stand out from the crowd.
Oh, absolutely. And we are actually starting to get even some very extremely large enterprises are coming to us saying, hey, traditionally we used you guys for voice, but now we actually need you guys for WebRTC. We need you guys for a way we can integrate, WebRTC video and voice into our website, just to start communicating with our customers even better. And these are, I think that's kind of where the technologies are going. Where if you go back, 20 years, you have kind of like the old school, hey, we set up a ring group for 10, 20 people and now we're done. Now it's more of, hey, we want the ring group to be there. Plus we want to make sure that people can video conference in. Plus we want to make sure that, we can detect when someone's talking and we can actually transcribe what they're saying, because we need to send records to, the medical provider. And so it's kind of cool where there's like a fundamental shift. The telecom is not just over voice. It's all the different, capabilities, which is voice, video, texting, SMS, chat. And we're in a world where, if a provider just provides one or the other, I think they're going to be really struggling in the long run. I think a lot of providers need to have a fully functional solution and have it turnkey where you mentioned it earlier, which is easy to provision, get up and running, and then add more features and functionality to your customer based on what their business needs are.
And I think what you said there is quite interesting in terms of like this broad tapestry of solutions that companies are now being expected to provide, because one of the things that I think one of the learnings that's come out from my discussions with companies over the past year or so is that one of the reasons and one of the things that's happening is that companies are learning a lot more about how their employees want to communicate with them and how they want to talk to each other. So before, maybe it was, well, you were only working from home one day a week, so it didn't really matter if you wanted to call with video switched on, if you wanted to text all the time, or like how your personality meshed with those different products. Whereas now, especially as you say, if you're running a big company, suddenly it's not just what are my people willing to put up with for that one day a week they're not there. It's how do they really want to talk? How are they most productive? Is it video on, camera on? Is it text message on? Is it, some sort of WebRTC or Slack chat? And I think finding those examples are where, things are going to get really interesting, and sort of finding ways to figure out which customers fit which mold and how those fit together. So, I mean, is that the future of how people stay connected? Is it that tapestry, or is it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what we're seeing too is that, traditional kind of silos are now kind of blending together. And a good example is, with our platform, it's a very UC first mentality. But the platform also adds features like contact center as a service and, around the call center space. And what we're starting to see is that a lot of customers, they would go to one vendor for their contact center and then one vendor for their UC, and then a different vendor for their CPaaS, which is the similar, if you're familiar with Twilio. And what now we're starting to see is that, customers, they have their internal communications, but they also have to communicate with their, their actual customers. And so when you're thinking about from a holistic point of view, how does this all work? The UCaaS market is really interesting, because, we really talk about internal communications amongst, making sure that your employees are able to talk to each other. But now your employees, don't just talk to each other, but they have to talk to their customers. And we're seeing that, like in the contact center space, that people no longer want these big warehouses where there's 200 people in a warehouse, taking calls as fast as possible. And in that contact center space, we're starting to see that people are looking to have a distributed model also, so that you can quickly spin someone up. And if they're in the middle of the country, working remotely, they can just download an application onto the computer and start making calls. They don't have to be in the warehouse. And then you have chat that you can start talking to each other, and then you also have videos that you can jump on with your manager if you need to talk to them about a certain client or certain issues and stuff. And this is where it's getting exciting, because it's almost like all these different giant verticals in the past are now kind of collaborating or colliding on each other. And so, I think the companies that are doing really well are the ones that, you mentioned this earlier, that can provision the systems quickly, get them up and running, and then customize it based on the workflow that they need to, best communicate with their customers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if there's a vision of that captures the shift in working more than your gray box in a industrial site in America that used to be full of 200 contact center workers suddenly being broken up and having them spread all over the country. I think that's a pretty iconic vision that we'll keep with us in terms of how has working changed. So I guess, we're kind of sort of working our way through this topic. Are there any other thoughts you want to add in on the market or changes we've been seeing?
I think my only other thought is, the market's evolving pretty quickly. And a lot of times, we've been hearing that, voice is complicated, voice is tricky, and a lot of service providers try to stay away from voice for one reason or another. I think that's a disservice to your customers, if you're trying to stay away from the voice aspect, because it's so important for your customers to communicate. And they don't want a one-size-fits-all model anymore. They're looking for service providers that can come in and provide a solution, not just a typical phone system. And I think, I can give you a million different references from our service providers that, now lead with voice, because it's so important during the pandemic. And, I would say the one thing just to kind of leave off is, if you don't have a strong voice and, communication solution, you really need to get one, based on, where the pandemic's going. And I think working from home and working remotely is not going to change, once vaccinations are, like given out. I think it's going to be here for a while. And I think a lot of companies are now starting to turn to this hybrid model of, partly working from the office and partly working remotely. And so, based on that, service providers really need to make sure that they have a solution that can scale and, is distributed based on what their customers are looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea that everyone's going to rush back to their offices after months of enjoying working from home and being able to cook for themselves at lunch is an interesting question. I think we'll just have to see, even with all the vaccinations that have been going on, how quickly that trend works back. And it is true that no matter how much you text or email someone, you cannot get the same connection as you can by just simply picking up the phone and having a conversation.
Oh, absolutely. And I 100% agree with you. And I think, one of the pandemic's been awful, and, we obviously our hearts are out for everybody who's been suffering during it. But, the silver lining is, there's been some really interesting technologies that have, emerged. And I think, the evolution of, the traditional working from an office, it's now being forced on us to evolve. And I think in some ways that it's good, like I personally, I like waking up and pouring my coffee and starting to work versus having to, get ready for the office and then commute into the office and then waste all that time commuting. And so I enjoy actually working remotely. And I'm kind of intrigued to see, where the industry goes in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think just as we didn't really predict this was going to happen, I don't think we can really necessarily predict what is going to happen. Though, of course, I'm an analyst, so that is part of my job. And, I think that as I said before, I think that home working is one of those things that is at least here to stay more than it was, because as you say, some personalities and people, they just really enjoy it more than they enjoy the commute. And if it lets them live in the countryside and do the job that they used to have to live in the city to do, then that's a whole other type of lifestyle that you're enabling. And it is enabled ultimately by good communications, good calling, good voice, good video, and technology like yours.
Absolutely. Well, and that's the thing, is that no one knows exactly where the future is going to end up. And so our goal and as a company is we just try to give the service providers and resellers the technology that's malleable, that no matter where the industry ends up in a couple of years, the technology can support it. So, we're there for if customers, and, we'll always have a distributed team, or if they all go back to the office, and I think that's the key, is just making sure you have a flexible enough platform that can kind of evolve based on where work is going.
Absolutely. Right. Well, thank you, Patrick, for coming to speak to us. Of course, this has been a really enlightening session, and I'm sure that all of our listeners are going to be really interested in having heard your thoughts. Just to remind everyone, we have our event coming up on the 17th and 18th of March, which is the virtual version of the CloudCom Summit in London. So come along and hear more discussions like this from Cavell and other sort of industry-leading experts like Patrick. So if you've liked this, please do come along. And of course, please check out 2600 Hertz and their website if you're interested in UC, which you are because you've just listened to 18 minutes of a podcast about UC. So check out the website, have a look, and I'm sure you can get in touch with us or with them if you've got more questions about what the future is going to bring to this industry.
Finbar, I really appreciate it, and thank you so much, and I can't wait for your conference.
Fantastic. Well, see you there at least, on a camera maybe.
Virtually see you there, absolutely.
Yes, exactly.